You're listening to West Coast Water Justice, where we talk about water in the Western United States. I'm your host, Natalie Kilmer, and today we'll be talking with Brook Thompson from the Yurok and Karuk tribes.
My name is Brook Thompson. I'm from the Yurok and Karuk tribes. I'm enrolled Yurok. I'm working on my master's degree in environmental engineering with a focus on water resources and hydrology. And last year I got my BS in civil engineering with a minor in political science from Portland State University. I am currently an intern for the California State Water Resource Control Board, Office of Information and Management, and I'm also an intern for Save California Salmon, where I help with general stuff, but mainly media.
Did you grow up in the area of the Yurok, like the traditional Yurok tribe area?
Yeah, so kind of how my situation was for a lot of my life is my dad lived on the reservation / around the res in Klamath, California, and my mom lived in Portland, Oregon. And my dad's family is Native and my mom's white. And so I would go to school in Portland for a lot of the time. And then I'd go to California during all my breaks. And then most importantly, during the summer, because that's when salmon fishing is and ceremony is. And then I'd live with my grandfather, Iwok Archie Thompson, who was the last L1 speaker of Yurok. So he was the last person to speak it, who was alive, to speak as his first language. And then I think in my titles, I also wanted to say, like, I consider myself a water protector, too.
And what does that mean to be a water protector?
To me, it means that I'm actively fighting and engaging with water rights to help secure Indigenous water rights and just kind of push people to make decisions that are best for not only people, but the environment and animals when it comes to water instead of profit.
How has the Yurok and or the Karuk, how have the folks in that area been affected by water rights, and has your life been impacted by that?
And I feel like the easier question is how has our life not been impacted by water rights? Water affects everything. Like the word Yurok literally means downriver people. And even my name, Brook, like a small stream. Everything's surrounded around the river. Our current reservation is a mile on either side of the Klamath River from the mouth, 30 miles up. And so even like our current day reservation boundaries are bounded by the river itself. We get a lot of our food from the river. A study with the Karuk tribe a few years ago in the early 2000s showed that traditionally people ate around 450 to like 500 pounds of salmon per person per year. And that in that study, it got lowered down to about 5. And I think it's probably even lower now. Like I'd probably estimate it's closer to 2 pounds per person per year. It's not a lot. And then when you lose those traditional foods, and that's not only salmon, but that's like lamprey, seaweed, all the other things we collect from the ocean and river, like sturgeon and candlefish, which are pretty much completely gone now. You lose that time with your family that you spend fishing, which impacts your mental health, your physical health, because you're not actually out there fishing. And also you're not getting those good nutrients, because I've seen fish that's even close to the same level of salmon that I've caught in the river sells for $30 to $50 per pound of salmon. And I can't afford that. And so we're not getting that healthy nutrition. So obesity rates increase, diabetes rates increase, and overall cardiovascular rates increase, which has been shown to come along with decline of the salmon and fish populations. And so just that alone, like this community health, the spiritual health, the mental health, and the spiritual health is coming from a lot of our ceremonies revolving around fishing and salmon. Like almost all the tribes in the area used to have a first salmon ceremony that we don't even have anymore because it required damming up the river and catching salmon with spears. And we're just not able to do that. We lost that. There's some tribes who still participate, but still not to like where it was, and we can't participate fully and how it was done traditionally. You're losing all that health, and then you have the mental health crisis where then there's not a lot to do on the reservation, and you're not feeding your body well, and you're not doing ceremony as much because there's less ability to. And then, you have higher suicide rates because of that. Also, like the generational trauma passed on, that's also coinciding with the poor way that people have been treating our river and us. And then there's just like all the things about transportation. Like you really need a boat to get a lot of places on the river. And that was our highway. All our villages and areas are placed along the river because the river was our highway. And even our senses of directions traditionally in the language is based on the river itself, is like up the river and down the river, up the mountain and down the mountain, instead of north, south, east, and west, like you see typically used every day in the Western world we live in now. So it's like literally our whole worldview, our health, and our well being is based on this river. And I've definitely been impacted. And as I'm sure everyone else has as well. And I can, if you want, I can go into like the impacts I've seen just within my short lifetime.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. And then also, if you can give a comparison to like what your grandpa, you were saying the last L1 speaker, I'm sure he shared some of his experience with you in contrast.
Traditionally, like my grandpa would say, like how the river would be so full, you could pretty much walk across the backs of the salmon to the other side of it. And you used to be able to catch a salmon with a pitchfork pretty much out of the river and just flop it on shore. And now that would be practically impossible. And then in my lifetime, there was a time when I was a kid and I caught just over 130 salmon in one day with my dad. And that was too much. Like we had to take our net out of the water because then it became too much to like process the fish. Like we couldn't work that fast. And so like just seeing that contrast of then and then I caught a fish this last weekend. I was fishing and caught some. But before then I didn't catch any fish for 4 years. And so just that contrast in itself kind of shows how quickly this decline is happening. And like even this year, we were afraid we weren't going to have a spring run because there's hardly any springers, which are the Chinook that come in the springtime versus the fall. And now it seems like there might be a hybrid run that just came in, but it's just that uncertainty that's happening because of the changes that people and the climate have had on the river. So things that used to be down to a T when we used to know exactly when the salmon were going to come, about how much salmon we would get, etc., now it just becomes a gamble every single year. And then for me too, just the fact of like me experiencing the 2002 fish kill, which was when extra water got taken out of the Klamath during a drought year in 2002 in September. And this was due to poor policy decisions and also drought with climate change. And it caused tens of thousands of salmon to die. And it was the day after a ceremony for us. And I was 7 years old and remember walking along the shoreline, seeing piles of dead salmon on either side and being devastated because, right, these are salmon that aren't just like the food source, like I said. These are salmon that my ancestors specifically took care of and cultivated so I could live a good life now, and that I had the responsibility of taking care of so that my grandkids could survive off of them too. But instead, here they were from a poor decision, tens of thousands of my connections to my ancestors gone on the shoreline. And that was really hard to watch. And even now, I hear kids who didn't experience that firsthand still have trauma from it. They have passed down trauma from their relatives and how hard that was for them to see it. So now they're afraid there's going to be a fish kill each year, even though they didn't see it firsthand. And so that trauma is getting passed down even to our younger generations who are fighting really hard for our salmon too. I can't even explain how like my cousins and my uncles and aunties felt when they had to fight in the fish wars on the Klamath and not being able to fish at all because we were scapegoated in the community for like the reason for the salmon decline, even though we're not the thing that changed in the last 50 years.
Could you tell us more about the fish wars?
Oh yeah, so I'm not the best person to talk on the fish wars because that happened. The fish wars were in the 70s, and so pretty much what happened in like the most plain form is that natives weren't allowed to fish on the river, and we weren't allowed to gather fish. And part of the reasoning that was given for that is that natives were the reason for the fish decline, and we were taking too much, even though we have rules and management practices that have been working for us for thousands of years, like tens of thousands of years. And it definitely was not us causing the decline of the fish, but this has been done over and over again throughout the US, where natives are scapegoated as a reason for some kind of natural resource decline, which makes no sense. And pretty much people had to fight for the right to fish and kept fishing anyways. And it broke out with like actual like people getting beaten by billy clubs. A woman was like handcuffed and like groped by one of the officers, and like it was really horrible situation. And we eventually were able, because of the people fighting, to get our fishing rights back. And fishing rights has been hard for us in general because our treaties were never ratified by Congress. It was through like our reservation and different things through executive action by the president. And so it can honestly be taken away from us if they wanted to. We don't have like strict treaty rights like other tribes do, especially because we were so late into like being quote unquote colonized or having people like in contact with us, Westerners in contact. We have fishing rights now, but there's always a fear of them being taken away, and they could be taken away still.
So some other tribes have more concrete fishing rights. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like they have fishing rights written into the treaty and then were ratified by Congress, so it's harder to take them away. But then on the other hand, treaties are broken all the time, and then what's going to happen if they are broken? It's not a lot does. So it's kind of a weird balance of like, was it like a spectrum of how protected different rights are? But at the end of the day, none of us are completely safe from having our resources and what was promised to us taken away.
Where do the Yurok traditionally fish? Like, is it at the river mouth or is it more inland?
Well, I mean, you can look up online like maps of where like the traditional terrestrial area of the Yurok and like surrounding tribes are. I mean, and then yeah, we fish mainly on the river towards the mouth, but then also upstream quite a bit, and then it transitions into like Karuk and Hupa area, depending on different like parts of the river. When you get to like the Salmon and Trinity too, which goes into the Klamath, and so we don't fish super far inland, but we're more coastal than the other tribes, but we still fish other places than just the mouth.
Are the fish caught when they're swimming in from the ocean?
Yeah, so we catch the salmon, right? The salmon go in the riverbeds and streams and breed and then live in the river for a few years. And then when they go out to the ocean, they get larger, like way larger for a few years and then come back. And that's one of the issues with like that 2002 kill, is that because salmon go in like these different cohorts, that then that future cohort is affected all those future years. So the fish come back way larger, and then sometimes they'll stay out an extra year. It's not like an exact date always. And so we always joke about that with like the larger salmon, like, oh, this one stayed there an extra year. Um, and they'll come back in, and that's when we get them, is when they're going back to their breeding ground, and we catch them by the mouth. And then we catch them before like they really do their transformation, since salmon physically transform from like saltwater to freshwater fish, and they taste different when they transform. And also like this might be an interesting thing. So like we're so connected with salmon. Like I consider myself like a salmon snob. Like somehow some people are wine snobs. Like salmon tastes different, like when you catch it, what part of the river you catch it, what type of salmon, if it's the spring chinook, if it's a fall chinook, if it's a hybrid. All those things make a difference in how it tastes. And then I also think like how you kill it and then how quickly you process it makes a difference in how it tastes as well. And that's why I don't eat salmon anywhere else, is because even like the expensive stuff that I can't afford doesn't taste that great to me most of the time, because of everything that we put into it versus like their quick processing and being frozen and unfrozen, and then kind of the lack of love that goes into it. It tastes different for me. So then they go back to breed, and eventually they don't taste that good when you catch them, when they start to transform and go upstream. So we catch them kind of like before they do their transformation, or a little bit before. And sometimes they wait in the different parts of the river to go up. So they'll wait for like a rain or like different weather patterns. So sometimes they're just kind of hanging out in different parts of the river waiting for something to change for them to continue their journey. So yeah, we catch them right when they're returning home.
When were the dams put in place? The 4, I guess, right, that are going to be removed?
Okay, so the Klamath River dams are built in between 1911 and 1962. So there's 6 dams on the Klamath. The lowest one is Iron Gate Dam. Then there's the Coppic Dams, 1 and 2, so they're right next to each other. Then it's the J.C. Boyle Dam. And then when you go farther up the river, there's 2 more dams. Those 4 I just mentioned are the ones that are being considered to be taken out. There's like the Klamath Falls Dam, and then there's one more dam, and it's a lot smaller, but part of the dams are hydropower, part of them are like irrigation and flood control. They have different histories. Each of them were put in at different times, but they're really kind of recent in at least our history. I mean, Yurok people had like our technical first contact in 1851, and so like just before California became a state. So as far as like other tribes go, we were quote unquote like discovered really late in the game, and that's affected a lot of our history with that. So this infrastructure is new to us.
How long have the tribes lived in the area?
Yurok, Karuk, and Hupas are pretty close culturally. Like we participate in ceremonies together, but we all have different languages. We come from completely different areas. So Karuks got in the area first, and then it was Yuroks, and then Hupa, and then different tribes in the area are related to us, to like the Talawa and Wiyat and whatnot. But my understanding is Karuks have been here for at least 12,000 years, and that was a carbon dating of a spoon that was found. And so at least 12,000 years, as far as we can tell. They're like the science ones.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a long time.
Yeah.
But I kind of interrupted you, but I feel like that's important for people to know, like, because the U.S. hasn't been around for that long at all. And so 12,000 years is almost incomprehensible, I think, to people.
Yeah. Like for perspective, my grandfather was born in 1919. And so his grandparents would have been like around the first people to like come in contact with white folks. So not that long ago at all. I mean, when my grandpa was born, like he still was riding horses. There weren't TVs. It was a completely different world.
So they have the 4 dams, and the other dams that are higher up aren't necessarily affecting the salmon.
So, I mean, dams have multiple purposes, right? Not all of them are necessary. Like the hydropower isn't necessary, and the way that the dam's built, from an engineering perspective, like our information about dams and hydropower has changed significantly since they were built. And so now, one, they're going to eventually reach the end of their design life, and two, like they're not as efficient as they could be. And the Iron Gate doesn't even have a fish passage at all, so it's cutting off all that riverway that the salmon traditionally used. That was partially due to them allowing them to build the dam without a fish passage if they built a hatchery just south of the dam, which there is. But then now we know there's a lot of issues and controversy when it comes to hatchery fish, and they like might actually make the species weaker or outcompete with the wild salmon. And we're kind of seeing issues with that now, and it might mess with the genetic diversity. There's so many issues that come with hatcheries. And so it's not a real replacement for taking away that wild salmon habitat. And also at the time, a lot of Westerners didn't understand as much about salmon and kind of how they work in their life cycles. Even now, you see people struggling to build dams with accurate fish passages. So the top 2 dams are for irrigation, are going to still be used to hold the water back at Klamath Falls for irrigation purposes and flood control, which the farmers quote unquote like need because there's a lot of farming in Southern Oregon. So that's one of the other issues, is that the river crosses the border from California to Oregon, and whatever happens upriver, which is where the headwaters of the Klamath are, affects downriver. But we don't always have say in legislation that happens upriver. So even though there's decisions being made in Oregon about the dams, we don't have political say or pull in Oregon, being from California, but the decisions are going to affect what happens to us at the mouth of the Klamath River and downriver of where those decisions are made.
It sounds like there's still a threat, like critics are potentially still pushing to keep the dams in place.
Well, it's going to be a threat until it's actually removed. You can't relax until the dams are out. And then even then, right, it's not like the dams are gone, the salmon are going to come back and everything's going to be perfect. This is just like one step in a much longer fight to protecting the river and the resources. Because then we still have to worry about water diversions and what's going on with other California legislation when it comes to agriculture, and how that's going to affect, like, when droughts happen in the future, who gets water priority, who gets beneficial uses. It doesn't stop at the dam removal. That the dam removal is just one step in a larger fight for water rights. With that too, I think something that people don't realize a lot is that honestly, I don't want to be fighting for water rights. I want to be participating in my culture. I want to be basket weaving. I want to be at ceremony. I want to be fishing. I want to be with my family. Not saying that I don't enjoy this work or this isn't my passion, but just that I shouldn't have to do this work. This is literally all this time spent on this work is taken away from my cultural lifestyle and my ability to spend time with my family and participate in my culture. And now me and tons of other people have to spend all our time fighting basically to survive and be Indigenous people. And so our grandkids can be Indigenous people too. It feels really unfair, and it is really exhausting mentally and emotionally to keep trying to persuade people that we deserve to live pretty much on our homelands.
That totally makes sense. Like, not even just your generation, but like, it sounds like for multiple generations, Indigenous people in that area where you're at or where you grew up have been spending a lot of time on restoring the rivers, basically since the dams were put in. Is that correct?
I mean, I'd say basically since white people came to our area, honestly, even before we had direct contact, we're so interconnected with other tribes and the systems and the environment that things that people are doing around us, even if we weren't directly having our land taken by white people at that time, still affected us. I mean, like even today, like say we got all our rights, we got to live on our land and our ancestral land, and we were just isolated and got to do whatever we wanted to do. The fact that global warming is still happening, that climate change is still happening, what's happening around us with deforestation, with pollutants, with like DEET from like the 70s and all that other stuff, still means like it's almost impossible to live traditionally in our homelands. It's not like climate change or like poor policy stops at a borderline. The repercussions ripple out, and because of that, even if we were isolated and given all these things back to us, we would still do poorly. So it really requires that connection and networking with other tribes and people around us to make the world better for everyone pretty much and heal the world together. And so it's not just a fight for us and our water rights, but it's really a fight for everyone's water rights and for their grandchildren too.
As an engineering student, do you have innovative solutions to rehabilitate other dams? What's the next step if a lot of the dams are probably going to be needing to be replaced at some point in our lifetime?
When it comes to infrastructure and dams, and I should probably say like my goals as someone who's in education is I'm trying to bring together the nexus of public policy, civil engineering / like water infrastructure, and Indigenous backgrounds and knowledge to try to make better decisions going forward, especially for California when it comes to water, since that's a really unique combination to have and that work really well together, but not a lot of people intersect with. My understanding in California is that we're still very supportive of dams because we're trying to reach a renewable energy goal by a certain year, and that can be problematic because dams are and hydropower is considered renewable resources within the same boat as solar and wind, and I don't think it should be because of the other adverse environmental impacts, even if it doesn't have like carbon emissions like the other ones do, like coal or LNG does, liquefied natural gas. I know the US as a whole is moving away from dams in general. And a lot of dams are actually put up back in the day for like recreation purposes, not necessarily even for like hydropower or flood control. As far as I see going forward, it's again the combination of one, having better policy when it comes to agriculture in California, and then who gets water pretty much, and then two would be pushing recycled water. So recycled water is when you take water that has already been used, say like you wash your hands or you take a shower, or like even some places use water to wash over microchips, which is a big thing in California, right? And that water is not like necessarily super dirty. It's not like it has chemical pollutions necessarily or whatever else. That can be taken, put through a filter, and then say use that water you wash the dishes with to instead flush your toilet, where it doesn't need to be potable and drinkable, but it can still be useful. There's no necessarily a reason that we should be using water that's completely drinkable and fresh to be flushing our toilets with when we can keep using the same water. And so improving those systems for like irrigation, there's tons of things that recycled water can be used for depending on like how much it's filtered after the first use, where that could, I think, help our water usage quite a bit.
So kind of like capitalizing on gray water and water reuse.
Yeah. And I mean, that can be done on a major scale too, like even with wastewater treatment plants. And again, that requires better policy to push forward these innovations to be used, though. Because, I mean, in civil engineering, one of the things is that, like, or infrastructure, people are kind of afraid to use new materials and tactics. And part of it's like afraid of being sued, or this has already worked for so long, or that, like, it's cheaper because this is already in use so much. And so we need policy to push the ability to use these new technologies like recycled water and have them implemented more widely and researched more.
I love that you're doing that. Does it feel like the engineering world is changing on that level, or do you feel like kind of an outlier?
I feel like an outlier. I definitely feel like lawyers and engineers do not talk well with each other. So again, I was an intern for the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, and for me, I saw a lot of disconnect between when it came to like advocates for infrastructure and engineering and those who are lawyers on the other side listening and then making the policy for it. And there's not a lot of legislators in Congress who have a science background when more of them probably should. It's just we also just don't talk well to each other, and both those groups don't talk well to the public all the time. I mean, even in my tribe, like at public hearings is for water when, honestly, a lot of people on the reservation are experts because they're the ones who've lived with this their whole life and lived on the river and seen the impacts and seen when it happens to them. But they don't see themselves as experts necessarily. They see themselves as just living their lives and trying to get by. And so when you go to these hearings, when there's a digital disconnect and divide because not everyone can have stable phone service or internet service or transportation to go to these hearings and comment sessions. And then they'll hear people use these really big words that they're not used to and talk about these projects that they're confused by. And it's confusing to even when you have a college education to listen to and interpret sometimes. And then they just don't want to comment. So either don't have the ability to comment because of the lack of resources when it comes to internet and phone service, or then they'll feel like they can't comment because they're not smart enough to make comments on these issues since they aren't using the same words or don't quite understand entirely what's being talked about. So there's like an insecurity with that when people should really be more confident in what they're saying. And I believe in them. Just like those three areas, I feel like aren't just talking to each other enough in general. And I just really want to help bridge that.
The three areas being engineering.
Yeah, it's like infrastructure / like STEM / science versus policy and lawyers, and then just like the public, and then specifically like those with Indigenous backgrounds and having traditional knowledge.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, even for me, just an average citizen that's not Indigenous, it's super intimidating for me.
Yeah, it's like we forget how to speak normally.
Yeah. And it gets so technical. Okay. On that note, is there anything that you'd want the general public to know regarding this? How we can be supportive?
I think at like the heart of it, no, it's not just an issue on who gets salmon and when. And it's an issue about our lifestyle. It's an issue of our culture. It's an issue of health. It's an issue of suicide. It's an issue like of pretty much every aspect of what it means to be Indigenous is around our waterways. And that cannot be separated. I think it's hard for people who are forced here or like, came here for opportunities to have only been on certain land for even a few generations to really understand the depth that we have with places, especially for us who have the opportunity to remain in our ancestral homes. People have to understand that they're not going to fully understand how important this water is to us, how important the salmon is to us, and how it really affects us on every level. And even the decisions now are going to affect our grandchildren through epigenetics who haven't been born yet, through the traumas we are facing with the water currently. And that we want to not only improve water for ourselves, but for everyone. And I think that's just been the common goal with Indigenous people in general. I mean, like, A lot of settlers would have died if it wasn't for teaching how to grow corn and helping a lot of other people out. And even though we've been through like so many hardships throughout being colonized and throughout westward expansion and the gold rush and everything else, a lot of Indigenous people, I think, are some of the most caring and giving people I have met in general. And I'll sum it up by saying one thing that I've been told by different people on the river multiple times and was reminded of this last weekend when I was fishing, is that the best tasting salmon is the salmon that you give away to someone else who needs it. Even if you don't get to eat it yourself, the looks on their faces and knowing that their stomach is full is the best feeling that you can have.
Definitely. Okay, well, this has all been super important information that you're sharing. How can people learn more about your work?
If you want to contact me, my website is brookmthompson.com. So that's BROOKMTHOMPSON.com. And my Instagram is at Brook_M_Thompson if you want to follow me for updates.
That was Brook Thompson from the Yurok and Karuk tribes. She's currently in her master's program in environmental engineering at Stanford University. Thanks, Brook. You've been listening to West Coast Water Justice, produced by me, Natalie Kilmer. Subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. The music is from the album Now That's What I Call Surf by Tony Bald, Adam Inigias, and Danny Snyder.